Alrighty, everyone. So my name is Liz. You probably know me from the information desk at the Derry Public Library. I am the adult programming coordinator, and I am a both um, college taught and self-taught cinephile. I got into film really more in my teens as just a viewer, and got as I grew. My parents were wrong. My obsession did not go away, and I have been um, loving cinema ever since, and kind of decided to pursue it more as an intellectual pursuit. Obviously, there's no real money in that unless you're Roger Ebert. So I thankfully found a job at the Derry Public Library, which is now allowing me to oh, it's what I'm looking for, to pretty much have, give these programs. So today we're going to talk about film censorship, and I'm going to be highlighting two big examples, one in the United States, one in the United Kingdom. And film censorship is something that I, obviously as a librarian, I'm very passionate about. I would consider myself to be probably an absolutist in that, where even if I do not agree with what is being there, I think you do have the right to make what you want and distribute it. However, that does not mean you are exempt from criticism. But I mean, there are some films I think have no cultural or moral value at all, but I'm like, well, if you want to make that and people want to watch that, that is fine with you. I mean, I love Italian horror films, and I'm sure people look at that and go like, why do you waste your time on that? So going forward, we're just going to look at a quick definition of censorship. Sorry, new computer. I don't know if you missed it, but my personal laptop had a very bad encounter with a mug of tea. So it's currently being fixed. So I'm on the library computer. So what is censorship? So if we're going by just the Britannica definition, it is censorship. It's the changing or the suppression or prohibition of speech or writing that is deemed subversive of the common good. Or if we're going to do, I think the ACLU has a good definition that's a little bit more expanded. ACLU, if you're not familiar, stands for the American Civil Liberties Union, and they are a advocacy group who will defend free speech no matter what in, I think, pretty much most cases. They say censorship is the suppression of words, images, or ideas that are offensive, and it happens whenever some people succeed in imposing their personal or political moral values on others. Censorship can be carried out by the government as well as private pressure groups. So usually when people think of a banned film or a censored film, we usually think of it in terms of the government doing it. But in some of the examples we're going to look at, it is actually private groups or even self-censorship in this case. The United States is one where, as it is right now, we have the First Amendment, and I think it would be pretty impossible for even a local jurisdiction to say like something can't be made or something can't be shown without it having a pretty, fiery challenge in court. But of course, that is not the same in every country, as we will see. So first case, I'm going to go into the United States. So if you're familiar with the movie industry now, we have the rating system, the MPAA. There's everything from G to R. There used to be an X, now it is NC-17. But that was not always the case in terms of what was out there. So there used to be censorship in the United States, but it was not federal. It was usually state or municipal. And the image I have here, which is the Maryland State Board of Censors, they were notorious for being extremely censor heavy. Ironic considering Baltimore, Maryland is the birth of John Waters. If only the people who were on that censor board could have seen what was coming. So we had in 1915 the case of Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio. The Supreme Court actually held that movies are not protected by the First Amendment, and the ruling just allowed state and local boards to continue censoring films. Obviously, I don't think today's Supreme Court would hold or that decision to anything. I think especially not now that we have films like Saw getting made, but it is interesting when you look at history, what used to be considered free speech and what wasn't. And you also have to take into account the time. In 1915, film was fairly new, and there was still a big societal concern of what it could be, what it could influence. 1915, I'm actually starting to think 1918 might have been the year of that case, so I'm sorry. But 1915 was the year that D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation came out, and we actually saw that that film had real world consequences and effects and influence. So a lot of the challenges and a lot of the thought in that case came from this idea that films could potentially be dangerous, which, you know, throughout history, art has always been something that people can see as dangerous. In 1922, sorry, the lights went out. Well, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA, they formed, and this eventually became the MPAA. It is led by former Postmaster General William Hayes. And in 1927, there was starting to be a very big backlash in Hollywood. People think of old Hollywood, they think of a fairly squeaky clean image. That is not the case at all. I guess you could just, I mean, honestly, Hollywood is still a pretty raucous party place, but it was even worse back then. Like, if you think protections for like actors and child actors are bad now, think of how bad it was in the 20s. And there was also the case of Fatty Arbuckle. If you're not familiar with who he is, he was a silent film actor, and he was embroiled in a scandal in which there are multiple versions of the story, but a girl ended up dead next to him. So there was this backlash to Hollywood. It was being seen as this den of iniquity, and there was a moral panic of like, we need to do something. And Hollywood essentially decided we needed to police itself, and there was a lot of pressure from moral groups, a lot of religious groups saying, you need to create good content because your bad actions are infecting your movies, and your movies, your immoral movies, are affecting the innocent public. So the MPPDA made a list of do's and don'ts, and that became the Hays Code. So this is, quote, the code to maintain social and community values in the production of silent, synchronized, and talking motion pictures. And this really came into being in about 1930. However, it wasn't really enforced in the early 30s. If you are familiar with the Todd Browning film Freaks, that is a film that stars actual people who have deformities, people who are circus performers. That caused an outrage when it was released, but that was made in 1932, after the code came into being. So, I mean, there was a real outrage when that film came out, but you have to wonder, like, well, how is this film made? Answer was, there weren't really a lot of people who enforced it until, oh, sorry. This is why I need to look at my notes. So what was in the Hays Code? This is basically what it said. No picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be so thrown to the side of the crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. This actually pertains to Freaks, in which you are on the side of the freaks who, at the end of the film, let's say, have revenge on someone who wronged them. It also says correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, will be presented, and law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Basically, no blasphemy. And what could you not do in the Hays Code? You couldn't have nudity, you couldn't have sex, you couldn't have adultery, you couldn't have miscegenation, aka interracial relationships, you couldn't have homosexuality, illegal drugs, criminals being good or heroic, absolutely not allowed. So a Don Draper or a Walter White or pretty much anyone in a Martin Scorsese film couldn't get made. You could not show methods of committing a crime, so you could not, heist films, which often show stuff like safecracking, you could not show that, for example. You couldn't show sexual passion, couldn't ridicule the clergy or religion, you couldn't show childbirth. Lord's name cannot be taken in vain. So a lot of people would look at this and wonder, like, well, why was this a problem to begin with? Because again, we have, I think, not everybody, but I think a lot of people have a rose-tinted view of what old Hollywood was. Hollywood, even in the 20s and early 30s, was far riskier and in some cases more forward-thinking than you would give them credit for. There were films that showed Lesbian relationships. There was a film that showed an interracial kiss already, and there were films that showed women being very assertive. There were films that showed criminals kind of very gray, black and white. No, not black and white, but the shades of gray. Fritz Lang's M had come out in like 1931, which was, it's a German film, but that is a film that has a, not quite sympathetic, but it is essentially you're following around a murderer and you do somewhat develop sympathy for him. So that was something that was, I mean, almost probably would be shocking now, incredibly shocking back then. So first 4 years or so, the Hays Code really doesn't get enforced too much. And that changes with Joseph Breen when he becomes the chief enforcer in 1934. So he works closely with a group called the Catholic League of Decency. And that was when you really started to see the tamping down of a lot of what was considered immoral. And that's when you get the rise of these films that are a lot more, people would say, wholesome, squeaky clean. You know, it's, oh, I completely lost my train of thought. I was about to say, you still get films that are, you know, today considered a little bit problematic, but I think when they think of older Hollywood, they consistently think of films like It's a Wonderful Life, they think of Gone with the Wind, they think of The Wizard of Oz, and that is a very limited view of what early Hollywood was like. But because of the Hays Code and Joseph Breen's enforcement, that shaped what a lot of people viewed, because that was all that was really able to get produced. And the Hays Code really started to slip in the late 40s, post-World War II. In the 1950s was when it really started to just not be enforced again. That's when his power was diminishing, and he resigned in 1954. And in the late 50s, early 60s, the MPPDA started to become the MPAA and pretty much tried to form something to challenge him. And that's how we have the MPAA now. And they just decided to revise the code in the 50s, and they changed it. Rather than saying we are going to control what you can make and what you can put in a film, we are going to judge what you can put in a film, and we have the rating system we have now. And I will say, I have my critiques of the MPAA. I think what they deem an R and what they deem a PG-13, and some of their methodology is completely ludicrous. There's actually a great documentary you should see about the MPAA called This Film Is Not Yet Rated by Kirby Dick. But I will say, I will take the idea of we're just going to judge the content of your film versus you can't make that at all. Granted, in order to get a certain rating, in many cases, filmmakers will have to remove certain scenes, or they can appeal it. So at the very least, it is a little bit more, I would say, better for the creator than the Hays Code was. Moving on, we are going to my favorite segment, which is the UK and the video nasties. So feel free to unmute yourself. Has anyone ever heard of the term video nasty before? Okay, so this was a term that was popularized by the tabloid media in the late 70s, early 80s. So this was really how I came to learn about, you know, this is a personal subject for me, how I really came to learn about film censorship beyond just the general, you know, knowing in certain countries you can't see certain, you know, certain movies aren't allowed to be shown. I had a teacher in high school who was actually very adamant about talking to us about Zhang Yimou and how China suppresses his films, but we'll get to that later. I am a horror fan, and when I was really starting to get into it beyond the, you know, the classics everyone should see, I started to go like, oh, here's a list of banned movies. Wait a minute, movies are banned? And this is when I learned about the video nasties in the UK. So a little bit of background. With the 1970s, we had the rise of home video, and we also had the rise of exploitation films. So a couple of things led to the rise of exploitation films. Some of it was the idea of, let's just say, filmmaking being more democratized rather than it having to be made in a studio now. You could grab your equipment. You could make a film on your own. You could make something independently. George Romero proved that in 1968 with Night of the Living Dead. one of the most successful independent films ever made. And unfortunately, since George Romero did not copyright that, he did not see a lot of money from that. Thankfully, copyright wrote the next films. But there was also a reaction to the violence that people were seeing on the screen through Vietnam. I think there's also scholars that credit the trauma of World War II and the Korean War, where there was, and also this idea of, since we were coming out of this era where films had to be kind of squeaky clean, and also both in the rise in the United States and in the UK, the rise of more realism, there were people who were like, you know what, let's try to do something in our own. And there was on our own, and there was, I think, this idea to see how much can we shock people, and that led to some fairly disturbing and just gross titles. So with VHS, there was the availability at home now. So before, the stuff you could see on TV, or you could see it in the theaters. In the British film, they already had censors that could grade, similar to our rating system, grade films. They could demand that cuts be made. With VHS, it was kind of a free-for-all. There was really nothing in the UK regulating that. And parents started to see, oh no, our kids are watching movies like, Last House on the Left and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which arguably a bloodless movie, or, stuff like Cannibal Holocaust, and, similar to the charges against Hollywood in the Hays Code era, this is polluting our children's young minds. If I had to have kind of a US equivalent, I actually wouldn't consider the Hays period. I would actually consider our equivalent to be the recording warning label controversy, also of the 1980s. Interestingly enough, the UK had their own version of Tipper Gore, which was Mary Whitehouse, and she headed up the National Viewers and Listeners Association. They still exist, they're now called Media Watch. So there was this concern, some of it was homegrown, but a lot of it was hyped up both by Mary Whitehouse and by the tabloids, of this idea of, children are being corrupted. In some cases, they're being driven to violence, or adults being driven to violence by this. I mean, raise your hand if you think this sounds similar to when Columbine happened and people started blaming video games. But, I say this a lot. This is the problem with moral panics, is with moral panics, people don't want to solve a problem. They just want a scapegoat and they want a villain. And in this case, these ridiculously violent, in many cases tasteless movies, were the villain. So this led to, in 1984, the Video Recordings Act. So all films that were released on VHS had to possess a British Board of Film Censors classification. So, and of course, they could say these scenes have to be removed, content has to be cut in order to obtain classification. So let's say you want New Line wants to distribute Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The British Board of Censors could say you have to remove these 3 scenes to get any classification. So the way it would work in the US, if it was a rating, it would just be like, well, I will just have it be unrated. I might lose some distribution, but I'll distribute it the way I want. In the United Kingdom, if you supplied non-classified video, this resulted in criminal charges. So these were actually banned movies. And unfortunately, what this did for a lot of the, concerned citizens, the Mary Whitehouses of the country, is this really just made those movies more popular, because the tabloids were hyping it up. They were on TV talking about, like, this is going to rot your young brain. What do you think young teenagers are going to do? They're like, I need to see this. I know, because I have been a teenager and I heard about movies you shouldn't watch. And what did I do? I'm like, well, clearly I need to watch this. So really only succeeded in hyping up these films for people. In many cases, these, kids, adults, found a way to get these movies. But in some cases, there were films in the United Kingdom that were not seen uncensored until the early aughts. So there is a follow-up to this. It was changed a little bit. It was reformed a bit in the early 90s. They decided, okay, maybe this is going a bit too far. 2009, it was found that it was unenforceable, as the European Commission was not notified of this, because at this time, UK was a part of the European Union. And with the Video Recordings Act of 2010, it was both kind of repealed and revived a bit. It became enforceable again, but the act was severely amended. But with the Digital Economy Act, there's still certain stipulations. If anything, it's a little bit more like the Hays Code now, but if you know how a lot of British films are funded, a lot of them aren't independently funded. They actually get funding from the state. So it is a different system. So in some ways, the Video Recordings Act still lives in the United Kingdom. Moving on, we are now going to talk about one of my favorite films. And again, one of the best films you likely haven't seen. You may have heard of it. We're actually kind of sticking in Britain for this point. For Ken Russell's The Devils, fairly infamous. Actually, let me know, has anyone heard of this film? Oh, nobody. This is going to be fun. This is a 1971 film by Ken Russell. If you're not familiar with Ken Russell, he's directed films like Women in Love. He directed The Who's Tommy. He's probably best known for that. And he came out at a time where a lot of British filmmakers, or British film up to that point, had been fairly, I guess stodgy would be a good word. There was this idea of like kitchen sink realism, whereas Ken Russell is like, no, I want to have flair as a director. And he makes this film, which is based on a book, based on a play, supposedly based on a real event, about a Catholic priest who's accused of witchcraft. And it's actually, I think, a very good film about how hysteria can be used by powerful people in order to enforce their power, and how many people can be manipulated by hysteria to ultimately support something that is not in their interest. I really don't want to spoil this film. I think it's fantastic if you can ever find a way to see it. But it was also a very graphic film. Ken Russell is a director who likes to go extreme. So the central point of this film is there is hysteria all involving nuns. So there is not only nudity and sexuality, there are scenes of nudity and sexuality involving nuns. And in 1971, this is shocking. I think, honestly, I actually saw it at a screening years ago. I think it's still shocking. And there are some scenes, there is a scene where the nuns take a crucifix, a life-size crucifix, off of the wall of a church, and they do things with it. Again, this is something that I don't even think you could make today. In fact, I'm not sure how he made it in the 1970s. So this was distributed by Warner Brothers, and they wanted 2 scenes cut. The British Board of Censors asked that 2 scenes were cut, although actually the censor at the time in Britain, I hope I'm saying his name right, John Trevelyan, he actually fought for this film. He did say that as extreme and graphic and violent as this film is, there is a real point being made here. So he's like, well, if you cut these 2 scenes, this can be an X. And it was also an X in the United States. But, you know, obviously a film like this is going to have controversy. And there was an uproar when this was released. And pretty much after it was in the cinema, it was locked down. There was a video release and then nothing. Warner Brothers has actually had this under lock and key, and it has not released it on home media ever since. You cannot find it in North America. I don't think you can find it in Britain. And if you can, it's a heavily cut version. Actually, for a while, the original film print of Ken Russell, people thought it was completely lost. Fortunately, they were able to find it. I'm not sure of the condition of it, because there's been talk that certain scenes, they exist, but they just can't be integrated into a new print. And that is a shame, because the fact that this film has been locked up, people cannot even see this to judge it for themselves. There have been studios that have tried to censor and cut up films before. Another famous example is Sony with Terry Gilliam's Brazil. They didn't like his ending. They edited it themselves and they tried to release it. Terry Gilliam stole his film print and then started screening it for critics. But at the end of the day, you know, Terry Gilliam says, you can watch my version, you can watch the Love Conquers All version. This is one where, because of Warner Brothers, I don't know if it's not wanting to avoid controversy. I don't know if there is someone there who still is personally offended by it. They are not letting this see the light of day. And I think it is robbing people who want to see it from making a judgment themselves. In fact, there is a movement online called Free the Devils, and Guillermo del Toro, Oscar-winning director, has actually been very vocal in criticizing Warner Brothers for their suppression of this film. And again, if you know someone who has a region-free copy, I would recommend watching it. Just, be prepared. You're going to be shocked. I'm still, to this day, very happy and very lucky that I was able to see a screening at the Harvard Film Archive. So case 2, another case of self-censorship. You've probably heard of this film. Disney's Song of the South, aka the one film you are not finding on Disney Plus. So if you're familiar with this, you probably know what it is. If not, this is a 1946 musical. It is set in Reconstruction era South. A lot of people miscategorize it as taking place in antebellum times. It does not. But it was still heavily criticized for its depictions of African Americans and basically painting a cozier picture of Reconstruction than what actually existed. And contrary to popular opinion, this film was actually controversial upon release. The NAACP was not a fan of it when it came out, and Disney actually yanked it pretty quickly due to controversy. Throughout the 70s, you kind of saw, I think it aired a few times on The Wonderful World of Disney, and the songs endured way longer than the film does. They've yet to release it from the vault, and sorry. And as I've said before, you will not see this on Disney Plus. This is one, I think eventually The Devils is going to be released. I think Disney is going to sit on this one forever, which is a shame. I actually think if they were they could do it themselves or they could give it to someone else. But I think if they were to package this in a way with interviews with scholars who could present this in context and talk the controversy over, I mean, they've done this with other films like Gone with the Wind. I think it could be a very good teaching tool and a good film to have a discussion over. So these are two films that you likely haven't seen, may never see. I mean, thanks Disney Plus. You know, Disney owns the world. They don't have to release this now. Now we're going on to two films you likely have seen or at least have heard of. The first is The Last Temptation of Christ. I was discussing this a little bit earlier. Whenever you make a film dealing with religion, there are bound to be some people who are not happy. And my goodness, that was the case with Martin Scorsese's adaptation of the 1955, again, pardon me if I'm butchering this name, novel by Nikos Kazanakis. Again, not good with Greek names, I apologize. He wrote this in 1955, and it's essentially a novel about the idea that Jesus is tempted with the idea of like what kind of a life he could live without the crucifixion, a life with a wife, a life with children. The Catholic Church immediately banned it and told members not to read it. The Greek Orthodox Church excommunicated him. So this was already a hot book that a lot of people didn't want to touch. But Martin Scorsese, who is someone who I think makes very thoughtful films about faith, really wanted to make it. I think Barbara Hershey gave it to him on the set of Boxcar Bertha, and he wanted to make it since then. And he finally got a chance to make it. And this was a film that even making it was fraught because funding was an issue. So I think it's almost a miracle it got made. And just even before the film was released, this film was incredibly controversial. And there were theater chains that said they were not going to distribute it. I think it was, I think one of them was United Artists Theater Chain at the time, said they're not distributing it, and that was about 3,000 screens that would not show the film. There were certain towns that said they were not going to show it, and the film was banned in several countries: Greece, Turkey, Argentina. You still can't see it in the Philippines. You still can't see it in Singapore. But unlike The Devils and Song of the South, this was also a film that, in addition to being told, calling for a banning, this had violence that came with it. Martin Scorsese had death threats, and according to Roger Ebert, who was a supporter of this film, He says Martin Scorsese had to have bodyguards with him for years due to the threats he received from this. And there actually was a terrorist attack in Paris. A separatist Catholic group lit a theater on fire. And what I find is interesting is this is taking place right around the same time that Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses came out, and obviously he had threats on his life as well. And obviously we should not forget, you know, what he went through for his right to express himself freely either. How I just find it interesting that we have forgotten the violence and the threats that came from this controversy as well. And what I find interesting is, having seen this movie, I'm like, I think if a lot of people just maybe sat down and watched it, they might have a different opinion. If I had to find a comparison to this, it would probably be the recent French film, Mignons or Cuties, which came out. Netflix had a god-awful poster for it. And like the woman who made the film, who actually made it after a year of researching and interviewing people to make a film about how social media can negatively affect girls, now has threats on her life. And she has to, I think, leave the house when she does, because it's COVID, with someone watching her. It's another case of people saying what was in the film outside of the context of the film, or being angry with it without watching it, was driving people to violence. And in some cases, I think that can be even more harmful than even the government stepping in and saying, we're not going to show this. So final example is another film that got me kind of interested in the subject of banning. But this is interesting because it's sort of more about the lore of a banned film. So if you've heard of Battle Royale at all, it's probably in relation to either the Hunger Games, because it gets compared to it, or Quentin Tarantino is a huge fan of it. And this was a film that came out in the year 2000. It is an alternate timeline of Japan. It's a totalitarian dystopia. And there is a reality show where a class of students have to fight to the death. This was controversial in Japan when it came out as well. But it, you know, there was this idea of like, oh, this could play over in America. Because America, we were also having the anime boom in the late 90s, early aughts, and we were also kind of having the J-horror boom around this time. And so there were, Toei, the company that produced it, tried to shop it around. The thing is, if you remember what had happened 1 year earlier in the United States, Columbine, not a lot of distributors were very keen on distributing this film, and nobody wanted to release it in theaters. And again, they could not, no US distributor could reach an agreement with Toei. And so the film just wasn't officially released here. But the lore, if you were to go on message boards in the early aughts, was this film was banned in the United States. And sometimes that is not the case. It is a little bit more complicated than that, or there's a simpler, I guess I should say, less sexy answer than a film being banned. Again, this is a case of private companies deciding not to distribute something. And I would probably, if I had to compare it to another recent film that came out, I think it was this year, The Hunt, which was a film that had a trailer came out in late 2019, immediately caused controversy. The distributor and the pulled it from its schedule, and you almost saw online the idea of, it's like, oh, this is the film they don't want you to see. And some studios will actually kind of utilize this in order to get a bigger box office draw when the time comes to release it. Again, this idea of building myth making. But this is I just find it to be an interesting case because it's an instance of both national circumstance and just general distributor unease, which did make this film unable to find in the United States until about 2010. In fact, it was pretty much is Quentin Tarantino and the popularity of the Hunger Games, which really led to this film starting to become available. I think it was Anchor Bay finally released it. Interesting fact, though, you could find the book here and you could find the manga here, but the movie just no one wanted to put out. So moving on, I said I would talk about China. And I think they are China is a very interesting case. So if I were to tell you censorship happens in China, you'd say, well, no, duh. Um, if Cultural Revolution was a time from 1966 to 1977 where almost anything Western in that country was completely banned. Though in the 80s, and even into the 90s and even into the 2000s, there was this idea of their opening up, their appreciating free expression a bit more. And some of this was partially to keep up with the Hong Kong film industry and Taiwan, which has also had a fledgling film industry as well. Um, but I think it's in the past 15 years or so, the chokehold on the content in China has been tightening again. And I think there is a director who no better, I think, exemplifies kind of the ebb and flow of freedom of expression in China than director Zhang Yimou. If you know him from his more recent films, he's directed stuff like House of Flying Daggers and Hero, but he started out making films that were about peasant life in China, living through the Cultural Revolution, living through the Great Leap Forward, and they were not very friendly to the policies of the People's Republic of China. His film To Live, which was internationally acclaimed and is a wonderful film if you haven't seen it, it was not censored in China, but he was punished in China. He could not receive outside funding for 3 years, meaning he was completely dependent on Chinese funding, meaning he was much more under the thumb of what he could do. And he and Gong Li, the star, could not make any public appearances. And he eventually kind of got back into the good graces of the Chinese government by making kind of propagandistic nationalistic films like Hero. House of Flying Daggers, not so much, but if you watch Hero, I think I saw that in college and for a class, and we did have a discussion on how this is very nationalist propaganda for the People's Republic. But he seemed for a while like he struck a balance between making films for the state and being able to make films for himself until 2019, where he completed a film called 1 Second, which was about a man kind of living under the vice of the Cultural Revolution. It was set to premiere at, I believe it was Cannes Film Festival, and then all of a sudden People's Republic said, oh, it's not ready, there's some post-production issues. And to this day, this film has not been seen. So you might wonder, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, one of the biggest exports of the world that the United States has is films, and China is one of the biggest sources of our box office draw. If you go look on the website Box Office Mojo and look at the total gross of a film, go look at something like Avengers Endgame. Look at how much is grossed in the United States, and then look at how much is worldwide. Now, I'll guarantee you, China is a big part of that. And this isn't to be red scary or anything, but this is a fact. And the China's importance to studio box office has influenced what studios will put in their films. I think the most famous example was the Red Dawn remake. Initially, it was not supposed to be North Korea. It was supposed to be the Chinese invading a town, which, then they switched to North Korea because they're like, well, I mean, we can't get this film to play in China if it's Chinese or the villains. Actually, if anyone remembers the film 2012, that is one of the few American films that was shown at the time in China without any censorship, because that film heavily paints the Chinese as kind of the saviors. They were the ones that built the ships. There's actually a line in there like, only the Chinese could have done this that quickly. That movie made a lot of money in China. And there has been a lot of question in terms of Marvel movies or just bigger mainstream films of why don't we have any characters that are that are gay? And also another question of why do these films seem to be so passionless? Well, that is because homosexuality really frowned upon in China, and also a lot of heavily sexual content is not allowed in China as well. So by proxy, China's censorship policies are affecting United States films. I mean, I don't know about right now. Nothing really is being made, but that's kind of, I find it to be interesting how the freest country in the world is kind of having to suppress certain things in order to make money from one of the most repressive countries on the planet. And moving on, just to finish this off, just censored or banned films around the globe, old and new. So we had The Interview, the Seth Rogen, James Franco film, jokingly about the assassination of Kim Jong-un. That is banned in Russia and obviously banned in North Korea. Technically, all non-North Korean films are banned in North Korea. Noah, this was a surprising one, was banned in Muslim countries. And at first I was not sure why, because I'm like, but in the Quran, Noah, much like Jesus, is considered to be a prophet or a messenger, and you're not allowed to do that. I actually thought that that law only pertained to Muhammad. Turns out it's anybody, and that actually explains why in a Muslim country like Turkey, Last Temptation of Christ was not allowed as well. The Simpsons movie, this is probably the funnier example, banned in Burma because the use of yellow and red are seen as rebel colors. Last Tango in Paris, the Marlon Brando film, banned in Italy. The film where the director is from is actually banned until 1986 due to obscenity charges. There actually are things, if you've learned about the making of that movie and the director being exploitative, that are definitely cause for concern, but that is not why the film was banned. Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic, censored in Russia. All scenes pertaining to Elton John's sexuality were removed. Not sure how they had a movie with that because Elton John's kind of flaming, but no, I loved Rocket Man, but that was my thought. I'm like, this movie must be 30 minutes long. Salo, a film I wanted to talk about, but I think it would be better saved for controversial films. This is a film by Piero Pallasini, banned in numerous countries for obscenity and violence. It is definitely not a film for the weak of heart. That's one where there's a couple films where I'd say go Wikipedia and see if you want to watch it, but that's where I think I might just go, honestly don't. I've seen it once. It's a one and done. I get that it's a critique of fascism, but not like this. It was only released uncensored in the United Kingdom in 2000. This was a film that was made in the 1970s. Zoolander, the Ben Stiller film, due to the fact that the plot to assassinate the Malaysian president is a big point in the movie, even though it's comedic, it was banned in Malaysia for a while. Cannibal Holocaust, a film I mentioned earlier, a very famous entry in the exploitation film period. That is, again, very violent film, very graphic, banned or censored in numerous countries. Due to violence and animal cruelty, this is actually a film in which an animal death is seen on screen. They killed an animal specifically for the camera. You actually still cannot see this film in New Zealand. Actually, I will say I consider myself to be a free speech absolutist when I see films, but I draw the line at killing something on screen. And Battle of Algiers, great film if you've never seen it. That was banned in France until 1971. The only reason I can really find, I think the official reasoning was it didn't want to incite panic. But I think the better way to say it was, sore feelings in France. So that is the end of the program, and I will see if anyone has any questions or comments, or if you have any questions, which movies do you really want to see? Please don't yell at me. I warned you about Salo. Hello, Carol.
Yeah, just a couple questions. Your talk seemed primarily about movies, but you also alluded to a couple other types of art, like the news. You mentioned Vietnam, so I thought of the news, and I'm wondering if there was censorship after Vietnam on the news, and also 80s music videos.
80s music, first with the news, I mean, there are certain countries where you will definitely get an incredibly skewed version of the news. To go back to China, I remember being there in 2004. You definitely get a different version there than you would here. In the United States, I would say if there was anything, it was more self-censorship, because a lot of the footage that was coming out of Vietnam was incredibly terrifying, even if you remember the photographs of, you know, the man I cannot believe I'm blanking on that. The man being shot in the head, the girl running from napalm. We don't really have images of war like that broadcast, you know, on the nightly news anymore. But that again seems to me more of a private company decision rather than the country saying the state government saying you can't do that. But that's something where I think that is so country by country. I feel like that is something I don't know if I'm super qualified to talk about. Music videos, I did allude to it a little bit as you kind of saw that. You could kind of compare the video Nasty Panic to the Tipper Gore music videos and music lyrics. That was, again, that was more of a, I would just consider at the very least in the United States, kind of an outcry moment. There was definitely controversy, but I don't, again, this is something where I'm not super well versed on the music world. So I remember stuff with like the Madonna's Like a Prayer costing her, I think, some endorsement deals. But, you know, obviously she never faced any legal charges for it, which, you know, is again a good thing about the First Amendment, where the worst you might get is a whole lot of criticism, which at the end of the day, you can weather that. Again, unless someone's sending you death threats. That's where it's like, again, draw the line at that.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Anyone else have any other questions or comments?
I did have one other one.
Oh, sure.
When you were talking about the Hayes censorship, and I think that I wrote it down, but I don't have my notes in front of me. Breen came on the scene, what, 34 or so? 34, so about 4 years after the code was kind of created, but it really was a case of not many people cared to follow it because it wasn't a law. This was essentially Hollywood policing itself. Right. So what I'm wondering about, because I've seen some films from the 20s and the early 30s that were quite risque. Oh, yeah. You alluded to some of that. But what I find interesting when I think back to the 40s, that was a time when a lot of strong women were being portrayed. And I wonder how Breen felt about, say, Betty Davis or Katharine Hepburn. That's an interesting question because in a lot of cases, especially, so what's interesting was with the war effort, there was kind of this idea of like women being the backbone at home and women needing to be strong. So that actually kind of came into vogue and into fashion. But what Breen and a lot of like the moral guardians really had an issue with was women seeming loose, or the idea of women having like, you know, a partner without being married. That's really more where the you can't do that came in. I mean, with the Hays Code, what's interesting is some of it just kind of followed culture, where it was like, well, we need to make films where women are seen as, you know, strong and able to, you know, have a backbone because women are supporting the war effort at home. It's okay to have these. I mean, again, that's why I have my issues with the MPAA, but I'm like, oh, just have something like that rather than giving people these weird, vague guidelines that, depending on the context, you're like, oh, no, that one's fine. Like, I've looked through some of the Hays Code, and I'm just like, that's really my face of like, how did anyone make anything with this? Because some of them are very vague, this idea of, you know, I look at the one where it's like, you can't show the process of committing a crime. I'm like, well, does that mean you can't show a bank robbery at all? Or like shooting a gun, right? Yeah, or like, you know, you can't show how someone could obtain a gun. Or like, you can't show drug use. It's like, well, what if someone who comes along, you know, what if someone other than Breen came in and they decided, well, technically tobacco and alcohol are drugs. You can't show these in movies at all, which, if you watch films in the 40s, people are smoking, people are drinking. It's, you know, but that's why that's why I find it interesting, because I never thought anything would make me appreciate the MPAA, because I've had an issue with them for a while, and I'm like, oh no, this is better. This is fine.
I have either, I guess, a question or a comment. So. Something like Al Jolson or Gone with the Wind, do you think we'll actually see them on television anymore because of what's going on?
Oh, Well, Gone with the
You know,
Wind
I mean,
is on streaming. I think they did the right thing in terms of I think I mean, it's still shown on TV. I think the effort or the aspect of we're going to add a cultural conversation or people who can talk about it in context is good, because when a film is made, it's always a product of its time. There are films that are made now that I'm pretty sure 50 years from now, people are going to look at and go, why did they do that? Al Jolson's
right.
a trickier one. I mean, I
Yeah,
almost feel
singing
like,
in blackface, yeah.
oh yeah, I almost feel like because I am not someone directly affected by that, I don't know
Right.
how
Yeah,
valid
how do
my
you, yeah,
opinion is. I do think that,
exactly, right, yeah.
well, I do think that that stuff should be available to be evaluated, to be studied, to be criticized. I don't think anyone's gonna decide to air that. Although I will say, if there
Right.
is a film that is a very interesting and fascinating critique on blackface, and that is Spike Lee's Bamboozled. And that recently had a new release on the Criterion Collection, and it is a I think it was Susan Laurie Parks who wrote it, but or helped with it, or maybe I'm thinking of it something else. But that is a film that I think when I first saw it, I was too young to really get it, and then I saw it in a few years ago, and I'm like, oh, this movie's fantastic. But I mean, like, I think now when it's done, there is a lot of talk about, again, context. Are you mocking a person or not? I think a good example is, did anyone see the film Tropic Thunder? Great satire. If you like stuff like Blazing Saddles, Tropic Thunder would be up your alley. But Robert Downey Jr., this is a film that came out in 2008. He is in that in that whole film in blackface. However, the joke of that film is the fact that he is a white actor who, the studios would, rather than cast a black man in that role, they had the most famous actor in the world dye his skin black to play a black man. So the joke is not on degrading anyone who is black. The joke is more on the Hollywood studios and the ridiculousness of method actors like, say, Daniel Day-Lewis, whom I love, but I think Tropic Thunder is such a great riff on what he does.
You know, you actually brought up another movie, Blazing Saddles. You know, is that going to be seen with some of the phrasing in there?
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, when they bring out the N-word, are they gonna, you know, whatchamacallit,
Well, I think if
blank
it's
that
shown
out?
if it's shown on television, I think that that's going to get bleeped along with curse words. But
Right.
that's a film that's still, I think, fairly beloved, and most people who watch it, I think most people,
Get it,
especially
right.
people who are cinema fans, we do understand that, like, some stuff, it's like this movie was made at a different time, but we also understand Mel Brooks is not coming at this in malice. I mean, I think if someone looks, I think with a lot of films, if someone looks at a screenshot or a clip without having context, they might have a very different perspective and get mad. But that is why my big thing is always like, well, maybe you could watch the movie, or at the very least, I don't know, like, read a review, read an interview with the director, and maybe try to get some more context of it. But yeah, I think Blazing Saddles will endure. I don't know, comedy is always hard to pinpoint, because comedy, I'm going to paraphrase Drew McQueenie, who hosted a podcast that I love called 80s All Over, and he's a film writer. But he basically said, he goes, comedy ages quicker than other genres, because what is funny is always, it's so of the time, but bad comedy will age instantly, whereas good comedy, even if certain parts are dated, will endure. And I think that applies to stuff like Mel Brooks's work, where you're looking at a few things and you're like, okay, that's off color now, or we wouldn't do that now, but this movie is still funny.
You know, that's true of a lot of things, though. I mean, my wife likes to watch some of the old television shows that are on, and I look at them. You couldn't even make these shows now. People will look at them and just say, that's just so ridiculous that they're,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, first of all in the Family, you couldn't even put that on television now.
They actually
I mean,
did do a revival of it. So but some of it is, I always have a little bit of an issue with that phrasing, even though I use it myself, is because I'm like, if we were to make it, it wouldn't even be the same product, because
Right. Yeah.
stuff has changed.
Yeah, people's way of thinking changed, and
Oh yeah.
just everybody. Yeah, it's just it's some of there's there and the kids, the young generation doesn't seem to have the tolerance for some things
Yeah.
that and that's pretty sad because you
Mhm.
know, but
Well,
that
I
is what it
kind of
is.
think certain things like again some of the more awful instances of blackface. I'm like, well, it's good to not have tolerance for that.
Right.
You know better now.
Absolutely right. Yeah, no question about
But
that.
I do,
Yeah.
but I've seen people of all ages freaking out about stuff. Again, the Netflix Cuties thing that came out earlier this year. I'm like, guys, please go read an interview with that director, please. And again, I think the idea to make snap judgments is unfortunately knows no age group.
Mhm.
But
On that, I'm sorry, on that same subject, you just reminded me of another movie, Breakfast at Tiffany's. And was
oh,
it,
Mickey Rooney. Oh,
yeah, yeah, was that a big thing?
No. There were Western actors playing Asian characters as
John
recently
Wayne.
as, and this movie is great. But the 80s, The Year of Living Dangerously with Mel Gibson, Linda Hunt plays an Indonesian man, and she does not caricature that role at all. She is very good, but you think like, okay, if we were to tell this story today, they certainly would not have cast Linda Hunt.
But Mickey Rooney really was, that was a
I
character.
think there was actually at the time there, because there were Asian Americans who were, lived in the United States and were also acting. I think there was some uproar about that. I'd have to look into that one a bit more, but I do know that is a film that is consistently cited as let's just say a big oof. Because that movie is still, people really like it, but you look at that and you're like, oh, there's movies I like where I love the film, it's not that old, but Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I really like it, but then you hear the gay slur being dropped and you're like, oh, that's right, in the 80s they said that.
Yeah.
Well, how about Animal House? They talk about that movie now, like you couldn't even make that, because of,
See,
all the drinking.
Animal House ages better than people think it does.
Yeah,
That movie
yeah.
I rewatched recently, and that's one where I'm like, oh, this is actually I would say actually fairly in line with a lot of values of today, because there is that one scene where he has the devil and the angel on his head.
Yeah.
The angel is the one who prevails.
Wins out in that one, yeah.
The angel's the one that's like, what's wrong with you? Don't do that.
Yeah.
No, actually,
the fact that they brought up in that one, they bring up a 13. She's I'm only 13 or something. I think it was when they're.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be like now. Oof. Yeah, I don't think they'd even allow that. Even though
in defense of that movie, in universe, that character's like, oh crap, we've got to get married right away.
Yeah. Oh, I love to watch that movie too. It's hysterical.
It's again comedy. Like there is a reason that stuff has endured, because overall it's very funny. Versus, there's movies that were, there are a lot of comedies that were made in the 80s that have aged horribly. I think Porky's is one of those, and Revenge of the Nerds is a movie that I think was beloved for a while, but a lot of people look at it now as just like, this hasn't aged well.
Yeah. Well, some television shows haven't, you see all these, and some of them, they have not aged well at all. And it's like, oh my God, why are they even still putting these on? I see Friends is all over the place. And I think to myself, this show has not aged well at all.
One of my colleagues loves Friends. She's in earshot. I can't disparage it.
Okay.
But, at the same time, I think it's very good that we're able to have this discussion about these films rather than something just being locked away. And I think that's the tragedy of a film like The Devils being held captive by Warner Brothers or Disney Plus, saying we are never going to release Song of the South. That's the one where if I had to put money on any movie never seeing the light of day again, it's Song of the South.
Disney's not gonna. Their clean cut image. Are you kidding?
Disney already decided, like, we're just redoing that ride.
Unless, even if somebody probably offered them $10 billion and say, we'll pay you 10, they'd probably say no, because it just, what it would do to their image could be,
What's interesting is I have heard, there have been people who've seen that film And they said the biggest complaint I have about it is it's boring.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're like, it's not even that shocking. The Devils is one though where I wish people would see it, because I think there is the idea of people using, religion and politics mixing, and people using religion to manipulate people and take out people they don't like. I think that is a story that is as relevant as it could ever be. And Roger
Absolutely,
Ebert, his review of it, I mean, Roger Ebert, I was raised Catholic as well. I think Roger Ebert was devout. I could definitely tell reading it that it kind of rubbed him the wrong way a little bit, but he did have a good quote in there where he said, make no mistake, the Devils has a message for our time. For we learn from the mistakes of our past. We live in a time of violence, and it is only by looking in the mouth of the devil that we can examine his teeth. In a time when our nation is responsible for the violence on a global scale, it is only by bearing witness to the violence on a personal scale that we can bring the war home. And he also said at the end of his review, he's like, well, maybe if a few more filmmakers were tell it like it is, the way Ken Russell is, maybe this Devils incident back then, maybe wouldn't have happened. Not sure about that because they didn't have film back then, but his main point of maybe if we had more people who are willing to lay this stuff out in such a shocking way, the people who are far more manipulative maybe, might have a little bit of an opposition. And again, I think it is a shame that Warner Brothers is keeping people from seeing this film and having their own reactions. I mean, I've seen films that, again, I said, I'm done. I'm one and done. I've seen films where I've hit my limit.
Yeah.
But I do think that people should have the right to watch these things and make their own decisions. Although, again, I will warn you all against Salo. You don't need to watch that. you find people don't need to see that movie. Although I would read up on Policini. He was a very interesting director, and he was someone who dealt with censorship a lot. He dealt with a lot of challenges to his films. He was an ardent anti-fascist filmmaker. He was from Italy, so he lived through Mussolini.
Mussolini, right?
Yeah, very critical of that, and he met his end. It is not known if it was an accident, if it was a assassination, or just a random murder, but he met his end at a fairly young age. But
Sounds
he
like
is
a good
someone
movie
who,
to be made of that.
Yeah, he is someone who I think in the realm of film and definitely trying to have a voice has earned his place as a truth teller. And a lot of, especially, if you look at Germany, a lot of filmmakers, Fritz Lang most famously, and I'm blanking on the man who made To Be or Not to Be, but they left the country the minute they saw stuff getting bad, because they were already starting to have people tell them, oh, change your art. And that's when Fritz Lang left. He goes, when they're telling me how to make movies, that's how I can tell it's getting bad and I need to leave. So.
May I ask two more questions, and then I'll stop. But I walked in on you talking about Birth of a Nation, and I remember it had something about the Ku Klux Klan in there. I never saw the whole movie, but what happened to that film?
It is a film that you can still find it. Copies still exist. It is, at this point, it's similar to Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, where it is a film that has its place in cinema history, for better or for worse. Birth of a Nation, I think, is an incredibly, it's an insightful film, and it is a film that basically does glamorize the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, a lot of the tropes of the voracious, rapacious black man coming after, virginal white women that existed before Birth of a Nation, but that was something that brought that trope to the screen and disseminated it to the masses. It definitely, you could see, there were people who were like, yes, you can absolutely see the documented effect that this had. Yeah. But this is also a film that pioneered a lot of film techniques that we still use today. We actually watched parts of that film in my college course, and my professors did say, they're like, look, we know. This movie's, you're gonna be shocked, but just try to pay attention to the technicals. And
Yeah.
it is like, you look at a film in 1915 and you're like, wow, they're using like fade-in shots. That's fascinating. But you're also like, ooh, content-wise, it's bad. But again, as bad as it is, I would rather have it just be a film that people just, it has a reputation for being what it is, rather than having it being unavailable for no one to even, let's say, study or critique.
Mhm.
But yeah, like in, Triumph of the Will is a similar way, where, if you're unfamiliar with that film, that is the film that it's basically, I guess I could say, a Adolf Hitler propaganda piece. But it's another film that has very innovative editing techniques and filming techniques. And, it's kind of when you're like, oh, Leni Riefenstahl, we have so few women in film, and especially at that time, and look at what she did.
Yeah. Thank you.
But again, kind of that, like, it has its place in history, but it's just, it's just known for not being a good influence, because ultimately it can have an influence on culture. And, the people who made those films had to live with it.
So thank you.
No problem.
You answered my question. The other question I had, a little bit unrelated. I'm in my early 60s, and I have only seen for the first time in the last 5 years actual footage of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And I don't know whether that's because I just never saw them, or they weren't available, or when did they become available?
Oh, the actually I should not have that happy of a voice talking about that. Footage of the camps was actually pretty well available, especially when it first happened. Samuel Fuller, the director, he was in World War II, and he saw some of it. I think he might have shot footage. Like, there were news crews that and people who went and filmed the camps when they were liberated. There is a short, well, it's now considered a short film, called Night and Fog, that came out in the early 50s, and that had unedited footage from that. And Shoah, the 9-hour film, that has footage from that as well. Like that, it was pretty, I would say, widely available when it first happened. Again, I think just due to shock, and because there were a lot of survivors who were very adamant that this can't be forgotten. As to why we don't see it as much anymore, I sometimes feel like if I watch the History Channel and whatnot, but I do wonder if maybe there are some people who feel like, not even, I don't want to offend people, but the idea of, like, I don't feel right showing dead bodies of humans. Again, that's something where I don't know what the editorial choices are for that, but that footage has been around for a while. And I think Night and Fog is the first official film that was about the camps and liberation.
Maybe that's what I saw.
That's another, that came out in the early 50s, and that is another one. I know I constantly just plug the Criterion Collection, the Criterion Channel, but that's also on there. And I mean, if you have the time and the mental will, there's Shoah. That's something I have not decided to do, just because I'm like, I don't think I have that in me.
Yeah.
It's 9 hours long?
Yeah, it's that, and also, I mean, I was a history major in college, so I've read my share of books about horrible things happening, and I'm like, oh, at least a book I can put it down. I don't know if I want to see this.
Yeah.
Like, Iris Chang's book on Nanking comes to mind in terms of things where I'm like, oh, thank goodness this is a book and I can just close the page.
I guess the only reason I brought it up is if I know there's people that deny that this happened. I wonder how they would react if they saw the actual footage.
Well,
they wouldn't believe it.
That's the unfortunate thing about people. If you're that far down, I would say, like, I would consider that a conspiracy theory rabbit hole.
Yeah.
It's like the people who believe the earth is flat. You're just, no matter what people tell you,
they're not going to believe.
And at that point, I would say I would rather focus on the people who aren't that far down, the people who might be going down that, rather than the people who are so far down you can't.
I hear you. Yeah.
Any other questions? Unfortunately, we do have to get going. I teach a 5:30 a.m. gym class, so I do have to get home.
Oh,
Great job, Liz.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for
Thank you.
coming. And next month,
Thank you, Liz.
thank you. Next month, if you're in a holiday mood, I'm going to be talking about how films become Christmas films in the cultural canon. So if you're wondering why Die Hard is a Christmas movie now, this
Favorite.
is good for you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
thank you.
you.
Thanks, Liz.